Introduction to Syed Qutb's early life and literary phase. Syed Qutb was born in October 1906 in the small village of Musha, near Asyut in Upper Egypt. His family was of modest means but held a respected position in the community, with his father being a farmer and a local political activist. From an early age, Qutb displayed a sharp intellect and a deep love for learning. His mother, a pious and educated woman, played a significant role in nurturing his early interest in literature and religion. By the time he was 10, he had already memorized the entire Quran, a remarkable achievement that reflected his prodigious memory and dedication. In 1919, at the age of 13, Qutb left his village for Cairo to pursue higher education. This move marked the beginning of his exposure to a broader intellectual world. He enrolled in Dar al-Ulum, a prestigious teacher training college, where he studied Arabic literature, Islamic sciences, and modern pedagogy. During these formative years, he developed a passion for poetry and literary criticism, influenced by the works of classical Arab writers as well as contemporary Egyptian intellectuals. His early writings from this period reveal a young man deeply engaged with questions of identity, nationalism, and social justice. By the late 1920s, Qutb had begun establishing himself as a literary figure in Cairo's vibrant intellectual circles. He contributed essays and critiques to prominent magazines such as Al-Risalah and Al-Thaqafa, where he analyzed modern Arabic poetry and fiction. His critical approach was bold and often controversial, challenging established literary norms while advocating for a renewal of Arab cultural expression. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who were heavily influenced by European literary trends, Qutb sought to anchor his criticism in an authentic Arabic tradition, though he was not yet explicitly Islamist in his outlook. In 1933, he graduated from Dar al-Ulum and began working as a school inspector and teacher for the Egyptian Ministry of Education. This role allowed him to travel across Egypt, deepening his understanding of the country's social and economic disparities. His experiences during this time shaped his growing concern for issues of poverty, corruption, and colonial oppression. While he was still primarily a literary figure, his writings began to reflect a stronger moral and philosophical dimension, questioning the direction of Egyptian society under British influence. The 1940s marked a significant evolution in Qutb's thought. He published his first major literary work, The Task of the Poet in Life, in 1939, where he argued that poetry should serve a higher social and ethical purpose rather than mere aesthetic pleasure. This book positioned him as a leading voice in the debate over the role of literature in national revival. Around the same time, he also wrote The Battle Between Islam and Capitalism, signaling his increasing interest in socio-economic issues from an Islamic perspective. One of his most notable works from this period was A Child from the Village, an autobiographical novel published in 1946. The book painted a vivid picture of rural Egyptian life, blending nostalgia with sharp social critique. Unlike his later, more ideological writings, this novel was written in a lyrical, almost romantic style, revealing his deep emotional connection to his roots. It remains one of his most enduring literary contributions, admired for its rich storytelling and cultural insight. Despite his growing reputation as a writer, Qutb struggled with personal and ideological conflicts. He was deeply affected by the political turmoil of the time, including Egypt's struggle for independence and the rise of nationalist movements. His early admiration for secular nationalism began to wane as he became disillusioned with the failures of the Egyptian elite to bring about meaningful change. By the late 1940s, he was increasingly drawn to Islamic thought as an alternative framework for social and political reform. The turning point came in 1948 with the publication of Social Justice in Islam. This book marked his decisive shift from literary criticism to Islamic activism. Unlike his previous works, which were primarily cultural or philosophical, this text presented a comprehensive vision of an Islamic social order based on justice, equality, and divine law. Though not yet radical in tone, it laid the groundwork for his later revolutionary ideas. By the end of this phase, Qutb had already established himself as a major intellectual figure in Egypt. His journey from a village boy memorizing the Quran to a prominent literary critic and emerging Islamic thinker reflected the broader tensions of his time, between tradition and modernity, nationalism and religion, art and activism. The next phase of his life, shaped by his experiences in the West, would propel him further into the ideological path that would define his legacy. Syed Qutb's exposure to the West and disillusionment. In 1948, Syed Qutb embarked on a journey that would profoundly reshape his worldview. The Egyptian Ministry of Education sent him to the United States for advanced studies, a trip that was meant to broaden his pedagogical expertise but instead became a turning point in his intellectual and ideological evolution. At 42 years old, Qutb arrived in America with an open mind but also deep reservations about Western culture, shaped by his growing belief in Islam as a comprehensive social and political system. His time there, spanning nearly 2 years, would harden his convictions and set the stage for his later revolutionary writings. He first enrolled at Wilson Teachers College in Washington, D.C., where he studied educational administration. From the beginning, he was struck by the stark contrasts between Egyptian and American society. The material abundance and technological advancement of the U.S. fascinated him, but he was equally disturbed by what he saw as moral decay. In letters and essays, he described his shock at the casual interactions between men and women, the prevalence of alcohol, and what he perceived as the emptiness of American social life. Unlike earlier Egyptian reformers who had returned from the West with admiration for its progress, Qutb found himself repelled by its individualism and secularism. One of his most jarring experiences occurred in a church in Greeley, Colorado, where he spent a semester at the Colorado State College of Education. He attended a social gathering that included dancing, which he later described as lewd and devoid of spiritual meaning. This incident, among others, reinforced his belief that Western civilization had lost its moral foundation. His observations went beyond cultural criticism. He saw America's social freedoms as symptoms of a deeper sickness, a society that prioritized pleasure over principle, wealth over justice. While in the U.S., Qutb closely followed political developments, particularly the growing influence of Zionism and America's support for Israel, which deepened his anti-Western sentiments. The Palestinian Nakba of 1948, unfolding during his stay, left him embittered toward Western powers, whom he accused of enabling the displacement of Muslims. His writings from this period, though not yet as fiery as his later works, began framing the West as an existential threat to Islamic values. Despite his growing disillusionment, Qutb used his time in America to refine his ideas. He read extensively, from Western political theory to critiques of colonialism, and engaged in debates with fellow students and professors. Some of these exchanges only strengthened his resolve. In one notable encounter, he challenged a professor who defended the U.S.'s moral leadership, arguing that true justice could only come from divine law, not man-made systems. These discussions sharpened his ability to articulate Islamic alternatives to Western ideologies, a skill he would later deploy in his most famous works. By the time he returned to Egypt in 1951, Qutb was a changed man. The West had not softened his views, as some in the Egyptian government might have hoped, but had instead radicalized him. He came back convinced that blind imitation of Western models would only lead Egypt further astray. His earlier literary preoccupations gave way to a more urgent mission, the revival of Islam as a complete way of life, capable of resisting Western domination. This period also marked his formal affiliation with the Muslim Brotherhood, an organization whose emphasis on Islamic governance resonated with his newfound convictions. Though he had been sympathetic to their cause before his travels, his experiences in America cemented his commitment. He began writing for the Brotherhood's magazine, Al-Dawa, where his critiques of the West and calls for Islamic revival found a receptive audience. The seeds of his later revolutionary ideology were sown during these years. His encounters with American culture, politics, and academia didn't just disillusion him, they provided the raw material for his arguments against secular nationalism, capitalism, and Western imperialism. By the time he sat down to write Milestones a decade later, his time in the U.S. would loom large in his indictment of modern ignorance, Jahiliyyah. What began as an educational trip ended as a catalyst for one of the 20th century's most radical Islamic visions. Syed Qutb's transformation into Islamist leadership. The early 1950s marked a dramatic shift in Syed Qutb's life as he transitioned from intellectual theorist to active Islamist leader. When the Free Officers' Revolution toppled Egypt's monarchy in July 1952, many Egyptians, including Qutb, initially welcomed the change with cautious optimism. The young revolutionaries, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser and Mohammad Naguib, promised to end British influence and address the country's deep social inequalities. Qutb saw in this moment an unprecedented opportunity to reshape Egyptian society according to Islamic principles. As a respected intellectual with growing influence within the Muslim Brotherhood, Qutb found himself in a unique position during these turbulent years. His writings had already begun attracting attention within Islamist circles, particularly his book Social Justice in Islam, which presented a vision of society where Islamic law addressed modern economic and political challenges. The new revolutionary government, seeking intellectual legitimacy, initially courted Qutb and other Brotherhood thinkers. For a brief period, it appeared there might be common ground between the military revolutionaries and the Islamist movement. Qutb's relationship with the new regime developed quickly in those first months. He was appointed to the committee drafting a new constitution and contributed articles to major publications outlining his vision for an Islamic state. In Al-Risalah magazine, he argued that Egypt's revolution would only succeed if it embraced Islam as its foundational ideology rather than secular nationalism. His essays from this period reveal a man convinced that history had presented a decisive moment, that the crumbling of the old order created space for genuine Islamic revival. However, by mid-1953, the initial harmony between the Brotherhood and the Free Officers began fracturing. Qutb grew increasingly disillusioned as Nasser consolidated power and made clear his preference for Arab nationalism over Islamic governance. The breaking point came when the regime abandoned plans to implement Sharia law as the basis of Egypt's legal system. Qutb saw this as a fundamental betrayal of the revolution's promise and began openly criticizing the government's direction in his writings and speeches. His role within the Muslim Brotherhood evolved significantly during this period. Originally joining as an intellectual contributor, he now emerged as one of its most prominent ideologues and strategists. He helped draft the organization's political platform and became editor of its weekly newspaper, ALAIKKUM al-Muslimun. Through these channels, he articulated an increasingly bold vision of Islamic revolution that went beyond the Brotherhood's traditional reformist approach. His rhetoric grew more confrontational, framing the struggle as one between true Islam and the new pharaonic dictatorship emerging under Nasser. The government's tolerance for such criticism quickly evaporated. In January 1954, the regime outlawed the Muslim Brotherhood and launched mass arrests of its members. Qutb was among those detained, though he would later be released temporarily due to health concerns. This crackdown marked a definitive end to any hope of cooperation between the Islamists and the military government. For Qutb personally, it confirmed his darkest suspicions about secular nationalism and the impossibility of achieving Islamic governance through gradual reform. During his brief period of freedom in 1954, Qutb's writings took on a new urgency and radical edge. He worked secretly on what would become some of his most influential works, though they wouldn't be published until years later. His prison notebooks from this time reveal a mind grappling with fundamental questions about revolution, sacrifice, and the nature of true Islamic leadership. He began formulating concepts that would later shock the Muslim world, particularly the idea that contemporary Muslim societies had fallen into a state of pre-Islamic ignorance, jahiliyyah, that required complete transformation. The defining moment came in October 1954 when a Muslim Brotherhood member attempted to assassinate Nasser during a speech in Alexandria. Though the Brotherhood's leadership denied involvement, the regime used this as pretext for brutal reprisals. Qutb was arrested again, this time sentenced to 15 years of hard labor. As he entered Tura prison, he crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. The scholar had become a revolutionary, the critic had become a martyr in waiting. These 2 short years represented a crucial pivot in Qutb's life and thought. The initial hope that Islam might guide Egypt's post-revolutionary future gave way to bitter disillusionment and radical conviction. His experiences with the Nasser regime cemented his belief that political power, not just preaching and education, would be necessary to establish Islamic governance. The ideas he developed during this period, about the nature of Islamic revolution, the failure of nation-states, and the duty of true Muslims to challenge illegitimate rulers, would eventually make him one of the most influential and controversial thinkers in modern Islamic history. The crucible of prison, Syed Qutb's radicalization. The iron gates of Tura prison clanged shut behind Syed Qutb in late 1954, marking the beginning of a decade that would transform him from a dissident intellectual into one of Islam's most radical modern theorists. The harsh conditions of Nasser's prisons, the damp cells, the torture chambers, the back-breaking labor in limestone quarries, became the unlikely forge for ideas that would eventually shake the Muslim world. Confined with other Muslim Brotherhood members, Qutb found in this brutal environment not just suffering, but a strange kind of clarity about the nature of power, faith, and revolution. Prison life under Nasser's regime was designed to break men both physically and spiritually. Political prisoners faced systematic torture, electric shocks, beatings, sleep deprivation, all intended to extract false confessions and crush resistance. Qutb, already in his late 40s and never robust in health, endured these torments with a stoicism that surprised even his jailers. Fellow inmates would later recount how he turned his prison cell into a kind of monastery, maintaining prayer routines even when weakened by hunger, and using smuggled scraps of paper to continue writing. It was under these extreme conditions that his most radical ideas took shape. The prison years accelerated Qutb's ideological evolution in several crucial ways. Isolated from mainstream society and witnessing firsthand the regime's brutality, he became convinced that the Egyptian government, and by extension all Muslim societies claiming to be Islamic while rejecting Sharia, represented a new form of pre-Islamic ignorance, jahiliyyah. This wasn't merely theoretical for Qutb. He saw the prison guard sadism and the regime's lies as living proof of a society that had completely abandoned divine guidance. His famous distinction between true Islam and contemporary Muslim societies crystallized during these years of suffering. Despite the harsh conditions, or perhaps because of them, Qutb's literary output during this period was extraordinary. He managed to compose significant portions of his 30-volume Quranic commentary in the shade of the Quran, interpreting the sacred text through the lens of his prison experience. Unlike traditional exegeses that focused on linguistic or historical analysis, Qutb's commentary presented the Quran as a revolutionary manifesto, a call to arms against modern oppression. Passages about Pharaoh's tyranny or the struggles of early Muslims took on immediate political meaning when read in a Nasser-era torture prison. The turning point came around 1957 when Qutb was transferred to the prison hospital due to deteriorating health. This relative respite allowed him to organize his thoughts more systematically. It was here that he began drafting Milestones, the short but explosive work that would become his most famous and controversial text. Written in fragments between medical treatments, the book articulated a complete vision of Islamic revolution, rejecting gradual reform, declaring all man-made systems as inherently oppressive, and calling for a vanguard of true Muslims to rebuild society from its foundations. The manuscript circulated secretly among trusted prisoners before being smuggled out page by page. Qutb's prison correspondence reveals a man increasingly detached from worldly concerns. In letters to his sister Hamida, he spoke of prison as a purifying fire that burned away all illusions. Where once he had debated literary techniques or educational reform, now his writings focus solely on what he saw as the existential struggle between divine truth and human arrogance. This spiritual intensity alarmed even some fellow Islamists, who worried his ideas were becoming too extreme. But for Qutb, the years of imprisonment had revealed a simple truth: there could be no compromise with falsehood. By 1964, international pressure and Qutb's failing health led to his unexpected release. He emerged from prison physically diminished, gaunt, with chronic respiratory problems from years in damp cells, but intellectually transformed. The scholarly critic who had entered prison a decade earlier now carried the aura of a martyr and the uncompromising vision of a revolutionary prophet. His Milestones, published shortly after his release, immediately became a rallying cry for Islamists across the Arab world, and just as quickly earned the fury of the Egyptian regime. Those 10 years in the darkness of Nasser's prisons had accomplished what neither his American experience nor his early activism could. They had forged in Syed Qutb an absolute conviction that Islam needed not revival but revolution, and that this transformation would require not persuasion but confrontation. The ideas born in those prison cells would outlive their author, eventually inspiring Islamist movements from North Africa to Southeast Asia, though often in ways Qutb himself might not have recognized or endorsed. The Martyr's End, Syed Qutb's final ordeal. The last chapter of Syed Qutb's life unfolded with the grim inevitability of a man who had long stared into the abyss and found his reflection there. His brief taste of freedom after a decade in prison lasted barely a year before the state came for him again. In August 1965, Egyptian security forces stormed his modest Cairo apartment, seizing manuscripts, letters, and personal notes. The charge this time was not merely dissent but conspiracy, an alleged plot to overthrow the government, orchestrated by a reconstituted Muslim Brotherhood under Qutb's ideological guidance. The arrest was part of Nasser's sweeping crackdown on Islamists following an alleged assassination attempt, a familiar pretext for silencing opposition. But Qutb was no ordinary detainee. By then, his writings, especially Milestones, published the previous year, had electrified Islamist circles across the Arab world. The book's uncompromising call for a vanguard to purge Muslim societies of modern jahiliyyah, pre-Islamic ignorance, had made him a beacon for radicals and a mortal threat to regimes built on nationalism or secularism. For Nasser, Qutb's ideas were more dangerous than any armed plot. They struck at the legitimacy of his rule. The trial that followed was less a legal proceeding than a theatrical condemnation. Held in a makeshift courtroom, the proceedings were laced with irony. Qutb, weak from years of imprisonment and suffering from chronic asthma, stood accused of leading a violent insurrection, a man who had never fired a weapon, whose rebellion was waged entirely through words. Witnesses later recounted how he refused to plead for mercy or disavow his writings. When prosecutors demanded he renounce Milestones, he replied that he would never apologize for truth. His defiance was not reckless but calculated. He understood his execution would immortalize his ideas far more effectively than another prison term. Behind the scenes, intermediaries, including his brother Muhammad Qutb, pleaded for clemency, arguing that Syed was a scholar, not a militant. Some regime figures, wary of making him a martyr, reportedly floated the idea of exile. But Nasser, after wavering briefly, reportedly concluded that Qutb's ideology was too virulent to spare. The sentence came down in August 1966, death by hanging. Qutb spent his final days in a prison cell, writing letters and preparing spiritually. In one poignant note to his family, he compared his impending execution to the martyrdom of early Muslims, framing it not as an end but as a beginning. He requested two things: a clean white shroud and permission to pray one last time before the gallows, a request granted only in part. On the morning of August 29, guards led him to the courtyard of Cairo's central prison. Witnesses described him walking calmly, a slight smile on his face, murmuring Quranic verses as the noose was fitted. His last words, whispered before the trapdoor opened, were the Shahada, "There is no God but God." The regime expected his death to extinguish his influence. The opposite occurred. News of his execution sparked outrage across the Muslim world, from Morocco to Pakistan. Milestones, hastily banned in Egypt, circulated underground, then spread globally in translations. Young Islamists who had never met Qutb adopted him as a symbol of resistance against tyranny. Even his severed ties with the Muslim Brotherhood's mainstream, many of whom had distanced themselves from his later radicalism, could not diminish his aura. In death, he became a paradox, a man who had warned against blind hero worship yet was transformed into an icon. The legacy of those final months still reverberates. For some, Qutb's martyrdom validated his warning that truth and falsehood cannot coexist. For others, it underscored the tragic cost of ideological absolutism. What remains undeniable is that the frail, asthmatic scholar who met the hangman's noose in 1966 had already set in motion an intellectual revolution, one that would outlive empires, redefine jihad, and haunt the modern world long after his body was buried in an unmarked grave. The enduring shadow, Syed Qutb's complicated legacy. Few thinkers in modern Islamic history have cast as long or as contested a shadow as Syed Qutb. Since his execution in 1966, his ideas have traveled far beyond the cramped Cairo prison cell where he penned his most radical works, taking root in the minds of revolutionaries, scholars, and militants across the Muslim world and beyond. His legacy is not one of simple influence but of perpetual debate, a body of work so potent that it continues to divide those who encounter it, whether they see in him a martyr, a visionary, or a dangerous extremist. In the immediate aftermath of his death, Qutb's writings became a rallying point for Islamist movements disillusioned with the failures of Arab nationalism. The 1970s and 80s saw his works, particularly Milestones and In the Shade of the Quran, smuggled across borders and translated into dozens of languages. Young activists in Egypt, Syria, and beyond pored over his condemnation of secular regimes, finding in his words a blueprint for resistance. Figures like Abdullah Azzam, the Palestinian scholar who later mentored Osama bin Laden, cited Qutb as a foundational influence, adapting his concept of jahiliyyah to frame their own struggles against Western-backed governments. Yet Qutb's legacy was never monolithic. Even among those who revered him, fierce disagreements arose over how to interpret his ideas. The Muslim Brotherhood, from which he had drawn inspiration, increasingly distanced itself from his more radical conclusions, particularly his implicit endorsement of armed revolt against Muslim rulers deemed insufficiently Islamic. Brotherhood leaders like Hassan al-Hudaybi explicitly rejected Qutb's takfiri tendencies in works like Preachers, Not Judges, arguing that declaring entire societies apostate was a dangerous overreach. Meanwhile, radical offshoots, such as the groups that assassinated Egyptian President Anwar Sadat in 1981, invoked Qutb's name to justify their violence, seeing themselves as the vanguard he had called for. The spread of Qutb's ideas was not confined to the Arab world. In South Asia, his works found eager readers among Pakistani and Afghan jihadists during the Soviet-Afghan War. Ayman al-Zawahiri, the Egyptian surgeon who would later lead al-Qaeda, credited Qutb with shaping his worldview, calling the milestones a roadmap for Islamic revolution. Even in the West, Qutb's critiques of Western materialism and moral decay resonated with some Muslim intellectuals grappling with identity in diaspora. His description of America's spiritual emptiness, penned after his studies there in the 1940s, took on new relevance in an era of globalization. But Qutb's legacy is not solely the province of militants. Academics, theologians, and even political reformers have engaged deeply with his work, often extracting insights far removed from the violent ends to which others have put them. Scholars like Fazlur Rahman and Tariq Ramadan have wrestled with his critique of modernity, acknowledging its power while challenging his dichotomous framing of Islam versus the West. Meanwhile, mainstream Islamic institutions have sought to reclaim him as a literary and philosophical figure, emphasizing his early contributions to Quranic exegesis while downplaying his later radicalism. Perhaps the most paradoxical aspect of Qutb's legacy is how his own life defies easy categorization. The man who ended his days calling for revolution began them as a poet and literary critic, writing lyrical essays on Arabic aesthetics. The same thinker who denounced Western culture had once immersed himself in its literature, citing Dickens and Dostoevsky as influences. This complexity has made him a Rorschach test for successive generations. To some, he is a hero of anti-colonial resistance, to others, a harbinger of religious extremism, and to still others, a tragic figure whose suffering in prison pushed him toward uncompromising absolutism. In the 21st century, Qutb's shadow has only grown longer. The Arab Spring uprisings of 2011 saw renewed interest in his ideas, with some protesters drawing parallels between his denunciation of Nasser's dictatorship and their own struggles against autocrats. At the same time, counterterrorism analysts continue to cite him as the godfather of modern jihadism, tracing a direct line from *milestones* to the manifestos of groups like ISIS. Meanwhile, in universities from Cairo to Cambridge, scholars pore over his texts, debating whether he was a product of his oppressive historical moment or an active architect of today's ideological divides. What endures, beyond the polemics, is the sheer power of Qutb's prose, his ability to articulate a vision of Islam as both a spiritual refuge and a revolutionary force. Whether one sees him as a prophet or a provocateur, his words continue to demand engagement, refusing to fade into history. In this sense, Syed Qutb achieved the immortality he seemed to foresee in his final days, not merely as a man who died for his beliefs, but as an idea that refuses to die.